Welcome back, guys, to the PLO Mastermind. In today's video, we will talk about preflop strategy, and I will introduce you to the concept of equity realization. Let's start off by looking at the definition of equity. Equity, also called raw equity, refers to the share of the pot that belongs to a player, assuming all players see a showdown. So here's an example: ace-ace king-king against 8-7-6-5. The equities are 56% for ace-ace king-king and 44% for 8-7-6-5. Now, assuming both players are all in pre-flop and there are $100 in the middle, ace-ace king-king on average is going to win $56, and 8-7-6-5 is going to win $44 because that is directly correlated to their equity or raw equity, given that both players did see a showdown. Let's have a look at a slightly different example. The button raises with 8-7-6-5. The big blind 3-bets with ace-ace king-king, and the button calls. Both players are 100 big blinds deep. Now the flop comes ace, 10-5 rainbow, and here are the respective equities. Ace-ace king-king has 85% equity, and 8-7-6-5 has 15% equity. So assuming to the pot share principle and the raw equity example from the prior slide, the 8-7-6-5 is supposed to win at this point 15% of the pot, assuming both players see a showdown. However, this is what happens. The big blind c-bets pot and the button folds with bottom pair and 15% equity. So what happened now to those 15% equity from the 8-7-6-5 hand? And this is where the concept of equity realization comes into play. So one player in this example was under-realizing its equity, and another player was over-realizing its equity. One player won 0% of the pot with 15% equity. Another player won 100% of the pot with 85% equity. So if those two players were already all in on the flop, then the 15% equity or 15% of the pot would have belonged to the 8-7-6-5. But in this case, because the 8-7-6-5 folded the flop, that equity remained under-realized for the 8-7-6-5 players and got over-realized by the ace-ace king-king player. So we should realize that raw equity is a metric that is only useful in all-in decisions when a showdown is guaranteed. For example, someone puts us all in on the flop. Now at this point, all we need to focus on are the pot odds and our raw equity. On the other side, equity realization is a useful metric in all situations that involve further action necessary to get the showdown. For example, if we defend the big blind, we have to think about and consider how our hand is going to play out on the flop, turn, and on the river. There are several factors in play that will sometimes work in your favor to over-realize your equity and sometimes work against you. It's important to be aware of them so that you can look out for them before you make a decision with your hand. The first one is the amount of players in the hand pre and post flop. Let's say there's an early position open raiser and you're sitting in middle position. Now, your hand might have the required equity to continue at this point, but you have to consider that there are 4 more players behind you, and those players can still raise or come in for the call. Pot odds has a huge impact on how much of your equity you're going to realize. Let's imagine your opponent would only bet 1 big blind on each street. Now, if that would be the case, you would have a much easier time defending a wide range of hands in the big blind because you know that you're going to have the right pot odds to continue on the flop, turn, or the river. Obviously, this is just a hypothetical example, and oftentimes your opponents are going to bet bigger, which will in return make you to fold some of your equity out of the pot and then therefore under-realize your equity. Range advantage is also a huge factor. Let's imagine that you 3-bet before the flop and your opponent calls, and there's an ace-high board, and you actually 3-bet some sort of rundown and have very poor equity on this board. Now, because your range is playing so strong on the ace-high board or has so much equity on average, your opponent will continue very tightly and actually overfold a lot of his hands against your exact holding because you were holding a range advantage. So that's an example where you're over-realizing your equity. The amount of streets left to play has a huge impact as well. Let's imagine you defend a hand in the big blind against the button open. You will have to consider that you will be playing out of position against that one player who's in position for the flop, turn, and on the river. That means your opponent is able to apply pressure from in position for 3 streets left to come. Now, obviously, if your opponent is going to be betting on the turn, then you only have 1 more street left to worry about. So the amount of streets left will have a big impact on how much of your equity you're able to realize. Then stack depth has a huge impact as well. Let's imagine you are defending the big blind against a button open raise. Now, if you only had one big blind left after calling, you could call a wide range of hands pre-flop because you wouldn't have to worry about getting bluffed off your hand post-flop anymore. You're very close to full equity realization. It only requires one more big blind. Obviously, in reality, what usually happens is that we are quite deep while playing out of position. That will lead us to actually play kind of tight because our opponent can leverage the positional advantage and also other factors such as range advantage across multiple streets very heavily, which in return will make us under-realize our equity. One of the biggest factors of equity realization is going to be position. The player with position is going to over-realize equity by default. That is because the out-of-position player has to continue tighter against the bet, given that he will remain out of position for multiple streets. The out-of-position player has to play generally more passive because he has to protect his checking range a lot more aggressively and more balanced than the in-position player, which overall leads to the in-position player over-realizing its equity by default. Another factor is also skill. If you're able to bluff your opponent off their equity, if you're able to play better than your opponent post-flop, that will also help you to over-realize your equity. Playability is a huge factor as well, especially for PLO. Different hand classes have different playability factors. Some hands are very smooth. Some hands have very visible equity against your opponent's betting range, and some hands are quite rough. If you have a rough hand, it's usually difficult to continue because you don't have a lot of backdoor draws, you don't have a lot of visible equity against your opponent's middling part of their range, and that makes you fold more often on the flop or the turn, and therefore under-realize your equity. And then lastly, blockers also have a big impact. If you have a hand that is going to have valuable blockers down the road, then that hand can obviously deny equity on your opponent's end by knowing that your opponent can't have the top of the range and then therefore over-realize its equity. So at this point, I would like to quickly talk about what EV is, expected value, and why it is important when it comes to explaining and showing the utility of the concept of equity realization. So EV stands for expected value and refers to the average amount of money or chips you win or lose from each play you make in the long term. So it describes basically how profitable a play is. Now, our entire decision-making process should be guided towards making the highest EV play at any point possible. And in order to understand what the highest EV play is, we need equity and equity realization to come to that conclusion. Here's an example of how this plays out and how non-linear equity and EV actually are. So here is a basic preflop hand example. The cutoff raises pot, the button 3-bets, and they're both 100 big blinds deep. The button 3-bets an 8% linear range, and we have those two starting hands as possible continues. King 5 deuce with a low suit, or 8-7-6-5 with a 7-6 of clubs. I think most players, even inexperienced PLO players, would probably prefer the second hand when it comes to continuing. Let's have a look how the solver would play this. So on the left-hand side, to start off with equities, we have 43% equity against button's 3-bet range, and the 8-7-6-5 hand has only 40% equity. So the hand on the right-hand side has actually less equity against the 3-bet range than King 5 deuce. However, if we look at the EVs that a solver attaches to both combos, we can see that the King 5 deuce is losing 3.5 big blinds against the 3-bet, which is basically our initial open raise, 3.5 big blinds, that we then have to fold. So the solver is suggesting that King 5 deuce with a low suit is folding against the 3-bet. 8-7-6-5 on the other side wants to call and then is losing 2.84 big blinds in the process. So we're basically winning back some of the money we already invested by open raising full pot / 3.5 big blinds. So this hand is actually higher EV than the King 5 deuce, even though it has less equity. So this leads us to the following conclusion. Raw equity is not equal to expected value. Just because a hand has more raw equity than another hand doesn't mean it is also higher EV at any given point in the game tree. In fact, we have to change this equation to raw equity times equity realization in order to have a stronger assessment of what expected value will be in any given spot. So raw equity does play a role in the computation of EV, but we have to add all the realization factors into the equation as well to have a better understanding of how we can determine expected value. Expected value, or optimizing for finding the highest EV play in any given spot, is the holy grail of poker players. If we were to know the highest EV play in any given spot in the game tree, we would be the best player by far in the entire world. But that's not possible. But what is possible is to become better than our opponents at assessing EV. So how do we solve EV to begin with in a more methodical way? We start with solvers. Solvers run billions of iterations to simulate each possible scenario and outcome to determine the expected value of all possible starting hands and lines within the framework of the simulation. So what does this actually mean? It means that a solver can take a hand pre-flop and run through all possible flops, through all possible combinations of our opponents to determine what the highest EV play is going to be. That's something a human can't do. And therefore, we are relying on solvers to give us and deliver the first framework for us to understand what most likely is going to be the highest EV play at any given spot in the game tree. So we will use solvers to guide us to better decision making by using their computations of EV for each possible starting hand and play. We will also consider that our opponents might not be playing within the framework of a balanced strategy and account for deviations that tend to be more optimal against such a strategy. So we're also looking for exploits. It is a myth that by using computations of solvers, we cannot maximize our EV in our opponent's strategy or against our strategy. That is not true. We can build exploits, we can become aware of exploits, and we can also protect ourselves from getting exploited in return. Here are some examples of how we're going to use PLO Trainer web app down the road in this course in order to find those results that the solver is creating. For example, the 8765 that we were using in this presentation as an example is here in the cutoff facing a 3-bet, and we can see in the middle what our suggested line should be, which is call, and then next to it attached the EV/expected value for our hand. The same thing is true for King King 5 deuce in the top left corner. We can see King King 5 deuce with the 5 deuce of diamonds is supposed to be a fold, losing 3.5 big blinds. This is it for today's presentation about equity realization. Hope you guys enjoyed it and see you in the next one.